working on the Lazy Daisy dress pattern. This is my third release, and this dress is meant to accompany the PDF pattern, which has instructions and illustrations. And if you don't already have that pattern, I will link that in the description below. Now, this video is going to go through the two views of this dress. View A has the ruffle bottom, and view B is a mini length that hits just above the knee. And with both views, I'm going through all of the instructions, but in this video, you'll hear some extra tips along the way, some sewing tricks that I've learned, and just some things to watch out for. Okay, before we get started sewing, I want to talk about the size charts for a moment. There's two of them. There's a straight size chart and a curvy size chart. And the difference between those two is the straight size chart is ranging from sizes A to L. And then the curvy size chart goes from HH all the way up to QQ. So it's a wider size range this time around. And the major difference between those two patterns is with the curvy size range, you're gonna have darts on the bodice, and that's really to accommodate a larger bust. So what I recommend when you're looking through the sizes and you're trying to figure out what size you're gonna start with, you're gonna start with your bust, because I hope you can see, there's a lot of ease right here. Here is my waist. And there is a roughly 8 inches of ease around the waist and around the hips. So you have a lot of room down here. Another way to pick your size, if you're worried about your waist and your hip being a little too large, maybe for the size that you're choosing according to your bust, is you can look at the finished measurements. That's usually how I choose my size in general for patterns, is I look at the finished measurements to see how much ease there is and how much ease do I want around my chest, waist, and hips. So make sure that you go back and take a look at that chart. And I implore you that if you're unsure about your size, make a version with fabric that you don't care about. I usually go to a thrift store and I get some sheets, some cotton sheets or linen sheets, buy it for less than $10, and you'll have about 3 to 4 yards of that, and you can use that for your first version of your dress. It takes the pressure off of getting it right the first time, because you might not get it right the first time. I never do. Whenever I'm working on a new pattern, I will use a bed sheet or just old linen that I don't really care about. I'll mark on that actual fabric the changes that I need to make for my real version. So I just wanted to recommend that to you. That way you don't feel so much pressure in choosing the correct size, and you'll figure that out along the way as you're making your first version, and then you'll make your final version. And another thing I want to point out in the instructions is the ruffle skirt for view A. It's not an actual pattern piece because I just wanted you to save paper, especially if you're taping your pattern together. So it's self-measured, but on the chart you'll see my recommended measurements. And if you're using the recommended measurements, it should look similar to what you're seeing in the dresses that I've posted or shared with you so far. If you want to lengthen it, that's a really easy adjustment. You can lengthen it, or if you want to have more gathering, you can add more width to your ruffle skirt. Okay, are you ready to get started? Let's go take out our pattern pieces. Let's go through the pattern pieces to make sure that you have everything that you need. You'll need 2 mirrored pairs of collar pieces if you're adding a collar. And you'll need 1 front facing piece. And you can also add interfacing if you have a really thin and drapey fabric like I do. And then you'll need 2 mirrored interfacing pieces for the collar and 2 mirrored back facing pieces. Again, the interfacing is optional for that. And your ties, of course, you'll need 2 ties and 2 pairs of pockets. Part 1, let's prep all the small stuff. To prepare the collar, we're going to use 2 interfacing pieces. The rough texture of that interfacing is going to go face down on the wrong side of your collar, and then you'll press in place. And same thing with the opposite side. Make sure that you're doing a mirrored pair and then you're just going to press that in place. Now you'll place both collar pieces right sides together and pin in place along the outer edges. Make sure to leave the top of the collar unpinned. Now let's take it over to the sewing machine, and you're going to sew along the collar sides and the bottom at 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. The collar edges can be tricky, so make sure to move slowly as you pivot through the corners. Now let's snip all of the curved seams, trim any extra seam allowance if needed, and we'll be flipping it with the right side out. You can use a point turner or your preferred method to make sure that all of the corners and the edges are flat. Now you'll repeat all these steps for the opposite collar piece and then press everything in place. And here's what your collar pieces should look like when you're all finished. And you're just gonna set them aside for later. And now let's work on the facing. We're gonna be attaching the front facing to the two back facing pieces. And let's first start by marking a notch right at the center of that front facing. Just a teeny tiny one. Make sure you don't oversnip. You could even just use a marker to mark that center notch. And then again, for my fabric, because I have a really lightweight and flimsy fabric, I'm adding interfacing. You do not need to do this if you have a heavier or medium weight fabric. Same for my back facing pieces. And again, I'm adding interfacing to my back facing pieces, but again, this step is optional. Now, if you are adding interfacing, make sure that you trim off 3/8 inch seam allowance off of your interfacing. I forgot to do that, so now I'm doing that now. If you don't do that, you're going to have a really thick seam allowance, and you do not want that on your collar. Now, if you haven't already done so, you're going to want to make sure that you mark your notches on your back facing and front facing pieces. That's where you're attaching it together right here. So you'll match the notches. It's the more angled side of the back facing piece. And you're going to match them both up, and it looks a little funny when it's face down, but when you open it, then you can sort of start to see the shape of the neckline. Now you'll sew those shoulder seams at 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance and press your seams open just like that. Then finish the raw edges around the bottom of the facing with a zigzag stitch or a serger. And here's what that should look like. Now moving on to the ties, you'll fold them in half lengthwise and then press in place. And now we're going to stitch around that raw edge by 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Make sure to leave one short end open, and then you'll repeat this for the second tie. And now we're going to trim the extra seam allowance. All right, now you can use a loop turner or a chopstick like I have, a sharp pointed object, because we're going to be turning these ties right side facing out. And I like to start, this is my preferred method. I use a chopstick, the sharper end, and I pull out the seams and poke it in right in the middle. You might want to take a big breath because this can be really frustrating. It is not tricky just for you. I think turning out ties is probably one of the most annoying things for most sewists. So I just go really slow. You can see that it's kind of tight on my chopstick because they're really small ties, but I just ease it in nice and slow. And there it is. It's starting to come out. It took me about 5 minutes probably. And then you'll just pull that off the chopstick. I'm also trying to make sure that those edges right there are as flat as they can be. That part is also really tricky. I'm just doing my best, and then pull it all the way out and you'll press that in place. Now I'm going to show you with a loop turner. Okay, I'll preface by saying a loop turner is not my favorite method typically, but it actually was a little bit faster this time around. So you'll hook it on the edge of that closed seam, and then I like to lick my fingers. I know that sounds really gross, but licking my fingers helps my fingers stick to the fabric as I'm pulling. So you'll notice I'm not actually pulling the loop turner itself. I'm pulling the fabric at the bottom edge through and just kind of wiggling it back and forth really slow. You don't want to just pull the loop turner. It will rip off the fabric and will potentially rip open that seam. And then you'll want to use another sharp object to flatten the seams at the end and then press everything in place. You did it. Now on to the pockets. You want to put that pocket pattern piece on top and mark all of your notches on both sides. Then you'll finish all of the curved edges on all 4 pocket pieces. And here's what that should look like. You can use a serger or a zigzag stitch. And if you use a serger, it might get a little wiggly like mine did, and all I had to do was press it with an iron and everything was flat again. All right, on to the bias tape. You're going to prepare roughly 1.5 to 2 yards or meters of bias tape for your arm openings. You're going to cut your strips at 1.25 inches or 3.2 centimeters along the bias of your fabric. Then you can use a bias tape maker like I am, or you can just fold in the long sides of the bias tape by 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Take your time going all the way down. You might have one big continuous piece of bias, but I just happened to pre-measure my armholes, and so I split mine into 2 pieces. Then you'll fold in and press one short end of the bias, and that's just preparing for a later step. Y'all, I completely forgot to do this step on my dress, so I'm just showing you here. You're about to stay stitch the front neckline and the back neckline of both bodices. I prefer to set my machine at a 2mm stitch length, and you'll start at the shoulder and head towards the center seam, sewing at a 1/8 inch or 0.3 centimeter seam allowance. Then once you get to the center seam of your bodice, you're going to flip it on the other side and sew starting from the opposite shoulder seam to the center notch. And don't forget to stay stitch your back dress neckline as well. Part 2, let's work on the back dress panels. You're going to place your back panels with right sides together, and before you pin them in place, just double check that you've marked all your notches. There's a top notch, a center notch, and right at the bottom there's a notch at 1.5 inches or 3.8 centimeters from the edge. Now you'll pin everything in place and make sure to stop pinning at the center seam notch. This is where the panels will be splitting open. Here's a little something that I like to do when I have a larger seam allowance. I just put a piece of washi tape at that seam allowance. That way I don't have to strain my eyes to try to see that line. And then as we start sewing, we're going to start from the bottom and go all the way up to that center seam notch. Now, as I approach that center notch, I like to reverse it and go forward just a few extra times to make sure that it's extra secure in that spot. Let's start with one panel and fold in the raw edge in half to the wrong side. The raw edge should be touching the seam allowance, and then you'll fold it over again and press it all in place. And of course, you'll repeat all of those steps again for the opposite side. Now we're going to start stitching from the bottom of the dress, and you're going to edge stitch the folded seam in place. Now you can also add another edge stitch right where that middle split is, just to give it a little extra security. So I'm going to start on the left hand side of my bodice, and while I keep the needle down, I'm going to lift the presser foot and pivot the dress around and continue along the rest of the opposite side. Part 3, Bodice and Neckline. If you're working with the straight size range, you're going to go ahead and skip this part. Now for the curvy view, we're going to first mark the apex, and here's how I like to do it. I just pop a little hole through my pattern, flip to the wrong side of my fabric, and use a fabric marker to mark where that apex is at. Then I snip into my dart legs. That way I have little notches on the actual fabric. So I'm marking my notches, and then I like to use a ruler to draw the guidelines for the dart legs that align with the apex. Now you'll fold your bodice with right sides together and line up the notches and the legs, and then you're going to pin the dart in place. You can use your finger to just give it a little crease, and then grab a pin and make sure to mark where your apex is at, and then pin along that guideline that you just drew. Now we'll stitch along the guideline dart, starting with the outer edge. And as you get closer to the apex, you're going to curve your stitch slightly towards the edge of the fabric. When you reach the apex, make sure that you don't backstitch. Instead, you're going to pull long threads, tie them together in a knot, and trim it off. All right, now we're going to press those darts down to the bottom of the dress. If you don't have a pressing ham, that's okay. I just barely got one about a month ago. And so you can press it on your ironing board, or you can use a pressing ham to get that curve right around the dart and just press it really good in place. Make sure that you're going down towards the bottom. Now we're going to be connecting the back bodice to the front bodice, and you're going to turn the back bodice with right side facing up and the front bodice with right side facing down, and connect the shoulder seams. We're going to sew that at a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Now you'll finish those seams with a serger or zigzag stitch and press them back towards the back bodice. Let's attach the two collar pieces to the front bodice. You had interfacing on one side of that collar. The interfacing side is going to be placed against the bodice, and you're going to line that up with that little notch that you marked earlier on your front bodice at the center. So you're going to line it up right there at that notch and pin it in place. And then you're going to pin the other one right at that center notch, pin it in place. And then you'll pin the rest of the collar pieces all the way around to the back of the dress. Once it's all pinned in place, you're going to baste it with the 1/4 inch or 0.6 centimeters seam allowance. And I should note that once you get to the back, you're going to notice that the collar ends at about 1/2 inch, which is 1.3 centimeters away from the back closure. It does not go all the way to the end of the back bodice seam. On to the facing. You're going to find the center notch of your front facing and align it with the center notch of the front neckline. Pin that in place, and then you're going to pin the facing all the way around the entirety of the dress. And if you haven't already done so earlier, you're just going to fold in the end of your facing to line up with the edge of that back dress, and then pin that in place. Now at a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance, you're going to sew across that facing. So I would go nice and slow because it's 3 layers of fabric. That's your facing, your collar, and your dress. So just make sure to go nice and slow and be careful around those curves. And then when you get towards the end of that facing, you will just realign. Make sure, because mine was not aligned with the edge of my dress, and I had to unpick a little bit and just redo that part because you don't want the facing to be peeking out of the dress. Now you'll clip the curved edges, and you can also trim the extra seam allowance if you have a heavier weight fabric. And then you'll use your iron and press the seam allowance towards the facing away from the dress. Okay, here's my seam allowance. It's all pressed and ready to go. I'm going to take it over to the machine with the right side of my dress facing down. The wrong side is facing up. Make sure to move that collar down and out of the way. You don't want to accidentally sew across that. And then you'll understitch the seam allowance to the facing at 1/8 inch or 0.3 centimeters. This will help prevent the facing from rolling out to the outside where the collar is at. And if you don't have a collar, I still would suggest you do this step because you don't want the facings to start rolling out on the outside of your dress. And before we move on to the back of the dress, make sure to press all of these seams, your collar and your facing really well. Now you're going to find the raw edge of one of your ties and place it underneath the facing by about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters from the outer edge, and then you'll fold the facing back over and pin it in place. And then you'll get your opposite tie, get the raw edge, fold it underneath the facing in the same spot as you did the other side, flip the facing back over and pin that in place. And then we're going to take it over to the machine and stitch all of that down. And then with the right side of the dress facing up and the top of the dress facing you. I'm going to start stitching right around the point where the facing is at. You're going to follow and trace that stitch line that is already there and head up towards the top of the dress. And I'm going to back stitch and forward stitch just a little extra to secure that tie. And then I'm going to continue pivoting around that tie. Just to give it some extra security, I'm making the shape of a rectangle around the edge of the back bodice. Now you've got the tie and the facing both stitched down, and you'll repeat this step for the opposite side. Part 4, Pockets and Side Seams. You're officially halfway done. On to the pockets. Make sure that you've marked your notches on the front and back panel of your dress. And then you're going to place each pocket starting from the notch, placing it on the notch on the dress with the right side facing, and then pin each one in place. Sew the pockets in place at a 1/4 inch or 0.6 seam allowance. Now you'll finish the raw edges of the side dress and the pockets, starting from the edge of the underarm to the end of the dress panel using a zigzag stitch or your serger. Now you'll use your finger or an iron to press that seam allowance towards the pocket and away from the dress. And we're going to stitch that in place. Now we'll understitch that seam allowance to the pocket. Typically you would do it with the right side facing up so you can see the seam. But I really wanted to show you from the back side so you can see how I'm actually catching that extra seam allowance and stitching it onto the pocket. And you can do it from the right side, or you can do it like I am from the back side of the dress. Then repeat steps 1 through 4 for the opposite pocket and the back dress pockets. With the right sides together, you're going to pin the front and the back dress panels along the side seams and around the pockets. When you're working on the pockets, make sure that you carefully match and pin the top and bottom seams of the pocket bag so everything sits nice and even. Add a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. You're going to sew along those side seams and pivot around the pockets. Press the side seam open as close to the pockets as you can. You'll notice it won't open all the way when you reach the pockets, but that is totally okay. Part 5, Armhole Closure. You're going to take one end of your bias tape and make sure that it's already folded over by 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Then you're going to match the raw edge of the bias to the raw edge of the armhole with the right sides together. The folded end of your bias can be aligned with the side seam like I'm doing it here. You can also start your bias at the shoulder seam or more towards the back of the armhole. It's really your preference where you start. And then you're going to pin it all around that armhole in place. And when you get back to the place where you started, you're going to overlap about 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter of your bias on top of where you started. So on top of that fold, I just like to remove the pin of what I already placed so it's aligned, and then repin it and trim off that excess bias tape. Now you'll sew along the crease of the bias tape at 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter all the way around. I like to remove my, what is that called? A sewing arm, I think. And then that makes it a little bit easier to slip the armhole into the machine so it can move a little more freely. And just take your time going all the way around, making sure that you're sewing along that crease of the bias. Then you'll clip and trim the extra seam allowance around the bias and make sure that you're careful that you don't accidentally cut into the seam. This is going to help everything lay nice and flat when you fold the bias over. And you want to make sure to press your seams out and away from the dress towards the bias before you move on to this step, folding it over, and then you're going to pin it in place. Now you'll top stitch the edge of the bias closed and press everything in place. Repeat all of these steps for the second armhole. Here's what it should look like when you're finished, and don't forget to press your seams in place. Part 6. Let's get to finishing this dress. Okay, my friends, if you are sewing view B, you are on your very last step. You're just going to sew your hem. So you're flipping the dress with the wrong side facing out and fold the bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter. Press that in place. And then make sure that you keep the side seams open as you fold along your hem. And then you're going to fold it again by 3/8 1 centimeter, and then press that in place. I like to start right at the side seam when I'm sewing my hem. So you're going to edge stitch that hem in place. And you are finished, my View B friends. Congratulations on sewing your own unique Lazy Daisy dress. Okay, this is for View A bottom skirt panel. You're going to make sure that you finished your raw edges along both short ends of your skirt. Place the back panel pieces together along the short ends with right sides together and pin in place. Then you'll sew those panels together with a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press your seams open when you finish. Now you're ready to prepare your hem. You're going to fold to the wrong side 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter and press that in place. Then you'll fold it again at 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter, and press that in place. Starting at the side seam, you're going to edge stitch the hem and press everything in place. Now we're about to move on to gathering stitches. What I like to do, just so I can remember a start and stop place, is I put a little pin or a clip at each side seam. The panel is really wide and it gets a little confusing if you have a big chunk of fabric like this. So adding little markers at the side seams will help you remember to stop and start your stitches. Adjust your machine to the highest tension and the longest stitch length for gathering your fabric. Now you're going to pull a long piece of thread out before you start. And when you put your needle down, you're not going to reverse. You're just going to straight stitch at a 1/4 inch or 0.6 centimeters across the top edge of that front panel only. So I'm starting at the side seam and ending at the opposite seam of the front panel. Now at this point I've reached the opposite seam of the front panel. This is where I placed my clip, so I'm going to stop stitching right here and making sure that my seams are still open. And then I'm just going to lift up the needle and pull out some extra thread so you have long thread. Now you're going to go back to the front panel where you started and you're going to sew another row of basting stitches at 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters. This means you're going to have 2 straight lines of basting stitches. And don't forget, when you get to the end of that seam, you're going to lift your needle, do not backstitch, and pull that extra thread out. And you're going to repeat both of these steps for the back panel now. Okay, you're getting so close to finishing. Here's what your skirt should look like. You're going to turn it wrong side out, so the right side is facing in. And we're going to get ready to slip the dress inside so we can attach the dress to the skirt. So I've got my dress right here. Here's the top of my dress with the right side facing out. I'm going to slip it inside of that skirt and pull it down through. I'm going to pull it all the way until the bottom hem reaches the top of the ruffled skirt. Then we're going to pin the two together at the dress's side seam and the seam of the two skirt panels. So I'm just aligning those seams. There is a lot of fabric here. So take your time, make sure that nothing is twisted, nothing is inside out. I'm facing right side to right side and pinning them together at the side seam. You can see right here that my seam right here accidentally closed. It should be opened. I think that happened when I was gathering the stitches. So I'm just gonna unpick a little bit right there to make sure that my seams stay open and flat. And then I'll continue pinning. Now let's gather the skirt by gently pulling the fabric along the threads to match the width of the front and back panels. You're going to evenly distribute the gathers and then we'll pin it in place. And you can see here on my skirt, it's really gathered already because I had my tension really high on my sewing machine. If yours doesn't look like mine and you need to gather, you're just going to have to pull a little bit more. For me, I think what I had to do is I had to pull it out and open up the skirt because it was a little too tightly gathered and it didn't match my dress. And before you start sewing, make sure your machine is set back to your regular stitch length. And then you're going to straight stitch at a 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter in between the two lines of basting stitches. Here's a little tip from mistakes that I've made before. You want to flip the fabric over every now and then just to check underneath to make sure everything is laying flat. There's just a lot of fabric being moved right now, and you don't want to accidentally sew a part of the dress into this seam. And here's what it looks like from the inside when you finish. You should have 3 rows right there, and then here's what it looks like from the outside. 1 row of basting stitches will most likely be showing. Now go finish the raw edge with a serger or a zigzag stitch and press all of your seams up towards the dress. Now we're going to unpick those basting stitches, and here's how I do it. I just unpick a few, and then I gently move the fabric along that piece of thread that I have in my hand. And it's so cool because the whole piece of thread is going to come out, and then that entire section will be done. I think that was as far as I can get it, and then I snip it, and that entire section is finished. You might just have to pull some extra threads out, and you're going to do the same for the rest of the skirt. Okay, you don't have to do this, but it does look really pretty, and it's also functional. You're going to add a top stitch just above the skirt panel on the dress, right above that seam line. And it'll hold that seam allowance in place, and it'll also look really nice from the outside. And you are finished. Congratulations on making your first Lazy Daisy dress.